Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Facilitated communication is a method used with non-speaking individuals, particularly those with autism or other communication disorders. A trained facilitator physically supports the person, often guiding their hand, wrist, or arm, to type or point to letters and symbols on a board or device. Proponents believe this method unlocks the true thoughts and voices of individuals who are otherwise unable to communicate. However, skeptics argue that scientific studies have repeatedly shown that facilitators unknowingly influence the messages, making FC an illusion rather than an authentic means of communication. Despite the controversy, FC continues to have a passionate following among families who believe it has transformed their loved one's ability to express themselves. The Telepathy Tapes is a podcast that takes the controversy even further, proposing that some non-speaking individuals are not just using FC but communicating telepathically, bypassing physical communication altogether. The podcast suggests that mainstream science is too rigid to recognize these abilities, framing telepathy as a suppressed phenomenon that could revolutionize our understanding of the mind. This claim shifts the debate beyond FC and into the realm of consciousness, metaphysics, and the limits of scientific inquiry, raising profound questions about whether our current methods of measuring cognition are too narrow to capture the full complexity of human thought. The following exploration delves into the deepest philosophical, ethical, and epistemological tensions within this debate, examining what is at stake when we accept or reject extraordinary claims. There is no fiercer battleground than the question of what counts as knowledge. The controversy surrounding facilitated communication, FC, and telepathic cognition is not just about whether these methods work, but about who gets to define reality. At its core, this is an epistemological war, a struggle between competing visions of what it means to know, to prove, and to believe. Is knowledge something that must be rigorously evidenced, or can it emerge through lived experience, even when science cannot yet explain it? Skeptics, armed with the banner of evidentialism, argue that knowledge requires justification through verifiable data. If FC and telepathy are real, they should be demonstrable under controlled conditions, yet every attempt to test them scientifically has failed. This leads to a stark conclusion: these methods do not constitute genuine knowledge. But proponents push back with reliabilism, the idea that knowledge arises from reliable processes, even if those processes are not yet understood. If a non-speaking child repeatedly spells out meaningful thoughts through FC, should that not count as valid knowledge, even if we cannot yet measure the mechanics behind it? This is where William James's pragmatic theory of truth disrupts the debate. James argued that truth should be evaluated based on its practical consequences. If an idea works, if it provides meaning and utility, then it holds some form of truth. Does this mean FC and telepathy are true in a functional sense, even if they lack scientific validation? The impact on families and caregivers is profound. Parents who once believed their children were locked in silence now see them as active participants in thought and emotion. If the belief itself transforms lives, should we dismiss it as false? Or does this risk embracing comforting illusions at the expense of scientific integrity? Michel Foucault would argue that this is not just a debate over truth, but over power. The institutions of science control what counts as legitimate knowledge, often dismissing alternative ways of knowing as pseudoscience. The Telepathy Tapes taps into this dynamic, positioning itself as a resistance movement against epistemic gatekeeping. It argues that mainstream science unfairly excludes telepathic phenomena, not because they have been disproven, but because they threaten the existing framework of knowledge. The debate then shifts. Is science truly rejecting FC and telepathy because they lack evidence, or because accepting them would require a radical restructuring of how we define communication and consciousness? Enter Thomas Kuhn's concept of paradigm shifts, the idea that scientific knowledge does not evolve smoothly, but through periodic revolutions where established frameworks collapse under disruptive new evidence. Kuhn's model raises an uncomfortable question. Is FC and telepathy being dismissed because they do not fit within the current paradigm, Or is science justified in rejecting them because the evidence is insufficient? Proponents argue that every major scientific revolution was initially ridiculed, from heliocentrism to quantum mechanics, before finally being accepted. But skeptics counter that not all rejected ideas were later vindicated. For every suppressed truth, there are countless discarded errors. This is where the debate remains in flux. If FC and telepathy are paradigm-shifting discoveries, they may one day be proven, fundamentally changing our understanding of mind and language. But if they are not, then belief in them represents a failure of skepticism, a cautionary tale of what happens when desire for truth overtakes the discipline of proof. The problem is that, in the present moment, we do not know which is the case. And that uncertainty, the space between conviction and doubt, is where the real battle over knowledge is being fought. Imagine a child who has never spoken a word. Years of silence, medical evaluations, and resigned acceptance have confirmed what everyone believes: there is nothing there. Then, through facilitated communication, the child types out, "I love you." Is this proof of an awakened mind, or the projection of someone else's hope? What does it mean to know something when the proof is both deeply personal and scientifically suspect? This is more than a debate about facilitated communication, FC, or telepathy. It is a war over epistemology, a battle for the very nature of knowledge itself. Is knowledge only what can be demonstrated under controlled conditions, or can it exist in forms that defy conventional validation, yet still transform lives? Skeptics and proponents are not merely arguing over FC or telepathic cognition, they are fighting over who gets to define reality. Evidentialism, the foundation of modern skepticism, demands hard proof before belief. Science insists that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and every controlled study of FC has failed this test. If a phenomenon cannot be replicated under experimental conditions, it does not count as knowledge. But proponents turn to reliabilism, which suggests that truth can emerge from experience, even if the process behind it is not yet understood. If FC repeatedly works in practice, should it not be recognized as knowledge, or does accepting it without validation open the door to comforting illusions? William James' pragmatic theory of truth complicates this further. If FC transforms lives, if it allows non-speaking individuals to connect with loved ones, express emotions and shape relationships, does that make it true in a functional sense? Should we measure truth only by its alignment with empirical evidence, or can we recognize truth in its real-world impact? James argued that ideas should be judged by their consequences, but does that mean truth should be measured by emotional resonance rather than scientific verification? If belief in FC improves lives, does rejecting it become a form of epistemic cruelty? Michel Foucault would argue that this is not just a debate over truth, but over power. Science does not merely describe reality, it defines it. Who decides what is valid knowledge? Foucault's power knowledge theory suggests that institutions shape what counts as truth, often dismissing alternative ways of knowing as pseudoscience. The telepathy tapes taps into this, positioning itself as a resistance movement against epistemic gatekeeping. It argues that mainstream science excludes telepathic cognition and FC, not necessarily because they have been proven false, but because they threaten existing frameworks of knowledge. The question then is not just whether FC and telepathy are real, it is whether they are being unfairly suppressed. You are standing in a crowded room. Before your eyes, a man slowly rises off the ground. He is not suspended by wires, nor is he resting on an invisible platform. The air around him is still. You search for the trick, waiting for the illusion to unravel, but it doesn't. He floats effortlessly, as if gravity itself has let him go. Your breath catches, your mind strains against the sight before you. Then a voice inside you whispers, what is more likely, that the fundamental laws of physics have been shattered, or that you are being deceived? This is the very essence of skepticism, the refusal to accept something extraordinary without extraordinary proof. It is the principle that has kept science from collapsing under its own wishful thinking, a rule that has protected human knowledge from the allure of the miraculous. But beneath its surface lies a hidden asymmetry. a shifting burden of proof that some ideas can never overcome. If the extraordinary always requires extraordinary evidence, then what happens to truths that exist beyond the reach of our current instruments? If the unseen is always dismissed until it is undeniable, does science risk rejecting reality before it even knows how to see it? Facilitated communication and telepathic cognition sit squarely within this epistemic paradox. Skeptics argue that FC should be held to the same rigorous standards as any scientific claim. Every controlled study has shown that when facilitators are blinded to the information, communication collapses. Likewise, telepathic cognition has never been reliably demonstrated under experimental conditions. If these claims were true, why do they consistently fail scientific scrutiny? Should science entertain an idea if it cannot survive its most basic tests? Karl Popper's falsifiability criterion demands that a claim must be testable in a way that allows for the possibility of it being proven false. If a claim cannot fail, it cannot be science. Critics argue that telepathic communication and FC violate this rule. Whenever they fail under controlled conditions, believers insist that the testing itself was flawed. They argue that telepathy requires a certain emotional connection, that FC is disrupted by artificial settings, that true cognition cannot be measured in a lab. But here lies the dilemma. What if a phenomenon exists that does not conform to our current models? If science refuses to study it because it cannot yet be tested in a familiar way, does it not risk becoming the very dogma it claims to oppose? David Hume's problem of induction raises an even more fundamental issue. Just because something has not yet been proven does not mean it never will be. Induction assumes that the future will resemble the past, that what has not been observed today will never be observed tomorrow. But the history of science warns us otherwise. Quantum mechanics was once an impossibility. The idea of microscopic organisms shaping disease was once laughable. The notion that time itself could slow down at high speeds was science fiction, until it wasn't. If science only accepts what has already been observed, how can it ever recognize something genuinely new? This ties directly into the bias of prior probability in Bayesian epistemology. Bayesian reasoning suggests that we evaluate new claims based on how likely they are given what we already know. If telepathy conflicts with everything we understand about neuroscience, its prior probability is extremely low. But this reasoning is self-reinforcing. If all new discoveries must fit within existing models to be considered plausible, how does anything revolutionary ever break through? Imagine a scientist in 1905 applying Bayesian reasoning to Einstein's theories of relativity. Based on everything they knew at the time, the prior probability of time dilation was absurd. And yet, Einstein was right. If Bayesian logic had been applied rigorously to every major scientific breakthrough, countless truths might have been discarded before they were ever explored. So we are left with a dilemma. If we accept telepathy and FC despite their current lack of evidence, we may embrace an illusion. But if we dismiss them because they do not fit within our models, do we risk ignoring a truth that simply does not yet conform to our tools of measurement? Skeptics push back with a warning. Extraordinary claims are more often wrong than right. From alchemy to phrenology, from cold fusion to polywater, the graveyard of discarded pseudosciences serves as a reminder that history is filled with ideas that felt true but collapsed under scrutiny. Science cannot afford to be too open-minded because for every one suppressed truth, there are thousands of compelling falsehoods. And yet, here we stand at the threshold of the unknown. We return to the opening dilemma. What is more likely, that gravity has been broken or that you are being deceived? But now, a more unsettling question emerges. What if you turn away too soon? What if you dismiss something before you even learn how to see it? If the history of science has taught us anything, it is this. Sometimes the most extraordinary truths are the ones we refuse to believe. You wake up from a dream about someone you haven't spoken to in years. Hours later, their name appears on your phone screen. No prelude, no warning, just a message arriving at the exact moment your thoughts aligned with theirs. You hesitate before replying, a flicker of something beyond coincidence brushing against the edges of your mind. Was this simply a statistical inevitability, one of the thousands of fleeting thoughts that happen to intersect with reality, or was something unseen moving between you? Moments like these don't fit easily into scientific models, and yet they happen often enough to provoke a quiet, lingering doubt. Is the mind truly confined to the brain? If telepathic cognition exists, it does not just challenge neuroscience, it upends everything we think we know about thought itself. The dominant model of cognition has long been materialist neuroscience, the belief that consciousness is not separate from the body, but a direct byproduct of neural activity. The mind, in this view, is no more independent than a shadow is from an object. It cannot exist without the biological machine that generates it. But if telepathic cognition is real, then this view is not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong. It would mean that thought is not limited to neurons and synapses, that consciousness extends beyond the biological container of the skull. It would mean that we do not just perceive the world, we exist in a way that allows us to reach into the minds of others, bypassing language, bypassing distance, bypassing every assumption we ever made about the isolation of the self. For centuries, the tension between dualism and materialism has shaped our understanding of the mind. Descartes, in his famous Cogito ergo sum, separated the mind from the body, proposing that consciousness was not just a function of the brain, but something distinct, immaterial, irreducible. Neuroscience rejected this, building a model in which thought is nothing more than electrical and chemical signals firing across neural networks. You are standing at a crossroads. Two doors, identical in appearance, loom before you. One leads to truth, the other to illusion, but you have no way of knowing which is which. A voice in your mind urges caution. Wait for proof before stepping foot. Another voice, softer but insistent, whispers that some truths can only be known by walking through the door, by trusting what cannot yet be seen. You hesitate, caught between two forces, the need for certainty and the risk of missing something extraordinary. The question is not just which door to choose, it is whether the very act of choosing will define what is real. In the debate over facilitated communication and telepathic cognition, the stakes are not merely scientific, they are ethical. What does it mean to believe in something that may not be true? And what does it mean to reject something that may be real? To believe too much is to risk deception. To believe too little is to risk missing a discovery that could change everything. This is not just an argument over evidence, but over responsibility, over what we owe to the pursuit of truth and to the people whose lives are shaped by it. In one corner stands William Clifford, his voice cold and unwavering. It is always wrong to believe something on insufficient evidence, he declares. Faith without proof is not just an intellectual error, it is a moral failure. False beliefs spread like disease, corroding the foundation of knowledge. Every time we accept something without verification, we weaken our ability to distinguish fact from fiction. On the other side, William James leans forward, a glimmer of defiance in his eyes. And yet, he counters, what if waiting for proof means missing something profound? What if certainty is impossible and the only way forward is to step onto the ice without knowing if it will hold? Skepticism can protect us from deception, but it can also rob us of truth. For the families of non-speaking individuals, this is not a philosophical exercise. It is a daily struggle. A mother watches as her son, silent for years, types his first sentence with the help of a facilitator. I love you. Her hands tremble, tears well in her eyes. This is the moment she has dreamed of, the proof that he has been there, thinking all along. But what if the words are not his? What if, in this moment of revelation, she is not unlocking his voice, but being deceived by another's? If facilitated communication is real, then rejecting it would be the greatest betrayal imaginable, the silencing of someone who has struggled to be heard. But if it is false, then its acceptance is not just an error. It is a theft, the creation of a voice that never existed. And so she stands in the middle of the storm, caught between the fear of believing too much and the terror of believing too little. Skeptics warn that FC is not just ineffective, but dangerous. Cases have emerged where facilitated messages led to false accusations of abuse, tearing families apart and leading to legal battles based on statements that, under scrutiny, were found to originate from the facilitator rather than the non-speaking individual. If FC is a deception, then it is not just a harmless illusion, it is an ethical failure that can destroy lives. From this perspective, skepticism is not just an intellectual position, but a moral duty, a safeguard against the real-world harm caused by unfounded belief. But belief, too, has its ethical weight. There are those who argue that science has, for centuries, underestimated non-speaking individuals, dismissing their potential based on flawed intelligence assessments that assume cognitive ability is inseparable from verbal expression. If FC provides an avenue, even a flawed one, for these individuals to be heard, then rejecting it outright could be a form of epistemic injustice, a refusal to recognize the possibility that our testing methods are inadequate. To deny FC based solely on existing research may not be caution, it may be a failure of imagination. This tension extends even further in the debate over telepathy. If telepathic cognition exists, then mainstream science has been rejecting one of the most profound discoveries in human history. If it does not exist, then belief in it distorts our understanding of consciousness, leading us down a path of pseudoscience that undermines legitimate inquiry. The ethics of belief demand that we weigh the risks carefully. Is it more dangerous to believe in something that is false or to reject something that is true? History has no shortage of ideas that were dismissed before they were understood. Germ theory was ridiculed, heliocentrism was blasphemy, quantum mechanics was madness. Science, for all its brilliance, has a pattern of rejecting what it cannot yet explain. But for every truth that was once silenced, there are thousands of falsehoods that deserved to die. The challenge is not just recognizing when skepticism becomes dogma, it is knowing whether today's dismissed ideas are tomorrow's revolutions or yesterday's illusions. If facilitated communication and telepathic cognition are real, then mainstream science has been rejecting one of the greatest discoveries in human history. But if they are not, then belief in them represents a corruption of our pursuit of truth, a cautionary tale of how deeply we can deceive ourselves when we want something to be real. This is not just a debate over knowledge, it is a battle over who gets to decide what counts as reality. And in that battle, certainty is a luxury that neither side possesses. And so we return to the two doors, the choice between skepticism and faith, between demanding proof and daring to believe. If the mind is only the brain, if telepathy is an illusion, then skepticism has protected us from wishful thinking. But if minds are truly connected, if cognition reaches beyond the skull, then rejection has kept us from understanding something extraordinary. Perhaps the greatest danger is not in choosing the wrong door, but in assuming that either door must be the final answer. Perhaps truth is not a single path, but a shifting landscape, one where certainty is always just beyond reach, and where the only real failure is the refusal to step forward at all. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. To learn more about the subjects covered today, check out the links in the show notes. Until next time.